I needed a job. I pled with McDonald's to give me a job at just selling hamburgers, because what does a divorced Baptist with a doctor's degree do?
This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I always have to read the title off the message board where my producer Ernie puts it up, because I can never remember anything, and including titles of my own books, et cetera, et cetera. But I am talking with a very old friend today, Jeff Clark, who also happens to run something that is very dear to me, and that is the Wild Goose Festival that I have been part of now since it started, founded by a friend of mine, Gareth Higgins, who I've also interviewed on this In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, taken over by Jeff. And we missed one, I think, last year with COVID.
Yes.
And then the year before that, I wasn't able to come. So there's been 2 years I haven't gone, but I've been at every other Wild Goose Festival.
Yes.
Let's just start, Jeff, before we get into who you are and everything, refresh people on when the dates of the festival are. When is this year's festival?
Thank you very much. Dates of the festival are Labor Day weekend, September 2nd through 5th.
And that takes place in
Hot Springs, North Carolina.
All right. And we're going to have all the links to people to the festival on our site. But just for anybody who's only listening on the podcast and can't get to a computer, how do people become part of the festival that I'll be speaking at? You'll be there. How do they become part of that?
Just go to wildgoosefestival.org, and all of the ticketing options are there. Many of the speakers are now displayed. Others are still coming. Yeah. It's basically near Asheville, North Carolina, between Asheville and Knoxville, Tennessee. And for some people that are coming from the West, they're a little surprised that it's only 8 miles into North Carolina. So it's actually an easy drive from Nashville, Cincinnati, so on and so forth.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit, Jeff. Let's you and me. I don't know how we converged. Was it because you read a book of mine, or did we meet at the festival? But it just seems to me like I've always known you, and you've always known me. There's got to be some point where we hadn't met or we didn't know about each other. But it's got to be a long time ago now. Just talk about your journey that's put you in charge of Wild Goose, who you are, and kind of how we met in that context.
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because I have sort of the same conclusion that you have. When did I not know Frank? And obviously there was a time I didn't know you, but I don't know when it was that I didn't know you. I've known who you were for a long time. I think for me, like many persons, I didn't even know I was an evangelical. I was just a country person, grew up in a small town, and I went to the church. And all the churches were the same. Some of them were called by different denominational names, but we were all the same, mostly dependent upon who our parents were as to where we went to church. And as I got older and got involved in stuff, I began to discover that I was an evangelical, not by my own commission, but that's just who I had become. And I was pretty active in that down through the years. Once upon a time, I owned a magazine back in the 70s around church growth, and around it a lot, taught your dad's book series in more than one church. In fact, I've periodically had book purges, and I did another purge last week. And some of them is because I need some things off my shelves, but some of it is I just need more places to put the new books. The books that I've never discarded are your dad's. In fact, ironically, the whole concept of he is there and he is not silent still remains a very central piece in my understanding of Revelation, about disclosure, if you will. So I was very much in that world, and I will confess that I did discard a lot of apologetics books last week. I'm not really sure that I've got much of a need to go back and reread Clark Pennock, etc. But so I always kind of knew your dad, and then as you came on the scene, I knew who you were. And then I got divorced. I got married first time as literally in high school. I was 17 years old, and we tried for a while, got divorced. And all of a sudden, this guy who had been on the board of directors of all kinds of stuff, and if I walked into a church, and I don't mean this arrogantly, but if I was on vacation and walked into a church, someone would quote from Timothy about being instant in season, and next thing you know, I'd be asked to speak or whatever. And I got divorced. And, it's been said that the Christian army may be the only army in the world that actually shoots its wounded. And so I became persona non grata literally overnight. I mean, boards that I was on just stopped sending me mail. They didn't even say, we're not going to nominate you again. So I was just out there, and it never really lost my faith center. I just didn't know where to put it or what to do with it. And, continue to read a little bit here and there. And then your honest to God was a big thing for me. I don't know, just something about the way, way that it processed and all. And so that was one of my very small sort of.
Bishop Pike?
Pardon?
Honest to God was.
No, I didn't mean honest to God. Your book.
You're talking about my book or my dad's book?
No, your book.
Okay. You're as bad as me on title.
Yeah, in fact, when you said that earlier, I thought, dang, I'm glad for that.
You're talking about my book. Okay, all right. I'm closing it. Patience with God or Crazy for God?
Crazy for God.
Yeah, my memoir.
Yeah, your memoir. And
although it's nice you mix me up with honest to God.
With Bishop, with Bishop Robinson.
If you're going to mix me up, that's a good one.
Well, because I think one of the things that happened for me was, I think it's happened for a lot of us, you sort of get through what we now popularly call deconstruction, and you kind of feel like you're out there by yourself, and maybe somehow or the other you missed the turn and all the other good people, were still on the right path. And so you just kind of don't have a place. And I read your work, and it kind of blew me away. I mean, in just a very incredible way. And then even today, when I when somebody asks me, and I get asked occasionally, what are the few things I should read? Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God is on my short list of 4 or 5 books.
Thank you.
And I think one of the things that your writing has done for me, I call it kind of the myth of Frank Schaeffer, because I can't honestly quote, well, partly because I'm old and don't remember, but partly because, like, the Why I'm an Atheist book created, I guess they would say in the old radio world, the theater of the mind. And so I've gone a lot of places. Probably you didn't even go. I don't even know whether I recollect your book the way you wrote the book. But the whole concept of holding mystery and holding divine and not demanding reconciliation, which was a perception of the whole propositional theology thing, because until you could sort of give that up, you're constantly still saying, but how do we make the equation equal? And for me, you were the person that basically said, this is not an equation, it's a life. And so, you're very centered in the way I process stuff. And I do remember when I met you, I think I met you once before, but one of the most exciting times of meeting you was the time, maybe it's the first time I met you at Wild Goose. Your wife, Jeannie, was with you.
Yes.
And like a lot of your readers, we know your family. And I was ecstatic to meet Jeannie. It's like, wow, here's Frank Schaeffer and Jeannie. It's like, holy crap, this is like Big Bargain Day.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, Jeannie remembers you very fondly too. And every time I've gone down to Wild Goose since, she's not big on crowds of people, and she did enough traveling with me in our lifetime in the first 15 years together to sort of do the whole thing.
Yeah.
Her idea of traveling now is to go visit one of her sisters in California and come home again. But she always wants me to greet you. And Jeannie always tells me that if she went to Wild Goose again, it would just be to see you anyway. So you and she had some real friendship quickly going.
Yeah.
Let me just back up a second, Jeff. I want people to know that you're also an academic with a real history of teaching and all the rest of it. Can you just give us a thumbnail sketch of that side of your life so we have the equation of who we're listening to today?
Yeah, the thumbnail that I started off as an accountant was an accountant for a religious organization out of our old tribe. Our plane crash killed the 3 ministers. I needed a job. A church hired me. I said, well, I need other education. I veered over and did a master's in theology and then did a doctorate in ministry. In the meantime, I had picked up an MBA And then when I got divorced, I needed a job. I pled with McDonald's to give me a job at just selling hamburgers, because what does a divorced Baptist with a doctor's degree do? And so I went back. By then, I'd had some other educational opportunities, and I went back to Northwestern University and did my doctorate in system science, interdisciplinary between business and engineering, and studied a lot of different things. I've done some work in labor policy. I've done a lot of work in strategy, a lot of work in futurism. Mm-hmm. And I'm the former advisory board distinguished professor of business systems and analytics at my current university here in the suburbs of Nashville. And I guess in that world, I think I've written maybe 40 something referee journal articles around that kinds of stuff, as well as several hundred other presentations. So I maintain I'm still there. I'm still on faculty. I'm so that's the other part.
It makes me smile because Wild Goose Festival, I try to describe it to people, somewhat facetiously, sort of ex-hippie Christian commune in the woods for 4 days, however you want to see it. Former Christian, struggling spirituality. But I'll tell you one thing, before you came on board, it would not be described as something that ran terribly efficiently. So it was a real overkill to have this systems analytic, crazy business degree guy who writes papers on how to make things run, take it over. And I'll just say it's run much better since. You probably will be able to get your ticket and your pass. And when you come to Wild Goose, you'll be able to find the tent I'm speaking in. You'll get a map that works and a camping space in the woods, or for you or for your RV or your family. Hey, this year, sort of building back again to where we were, how is the festival shaping up in terms of getting back on track for all of us Wild Goose fans, of which I'm just one? I always describe this as my favorite church anywhere. And I go there in all senses of the word religiously. Just tell us how things are looking this year as we try to get back up to speed.
We're moving. The phrase we're using a lot is we call it deliberate haste, because we've got to move with great alacrity. We've got to get there. We got to make things happen. Yet there are so many things that we don't know about yet. In fact, things just show up almost every day. So on the behind the scenes, the stuff that unless you happen to be paying attention to me now, you won't know happened. We've had just a lot of behind the scenes things problematic. Yesterday discovered that one of our major sources, probably the second largest person we deal with, backed out because we're requiring a fully vaccinated requirement. If you're on our site when our people are there, you must be vaccinated.
Which is great, because it's one reason that I'm going without any qualms.
Yeah, well, and this person said, I've got team members that are not vaccinated and they won't be vaccinated. I said, I really regret that. And we talked a minute, and the answer was, you can't be on our team this year. Yeah. Now, I'm just saying that, one, I guess, to make the point that vaccination is central, but then also, secondly, to say that as we make this sort of resurgence, and it reminds me in a lot of ways, even of your book, as we sort of try to reset ourselves after COVID, there's just a lot of places we have to move around on. So we moved around on a lot of that stuff. It takes some time. Overall, do you ever have somebody you totally trust, you totally believe, but you're just not sure you agree?
Yeah.
Our ticket person keeps telling me the numbers, and I'm telling you, I trust him, but I just can't believe we're doing that well. We won't be the biggest festival we've ever had, but ticket numbers are going well.
I remember one of them. What was the biggest one we had before all hell broke loose here? I forget the number.
2018 with Amy Grant, and that group was maybe the single largest we had.
And what was that? I forget what we had on the.
We had close to 4,000.
Yeah.
Everybody on site. And when we say that, when I count numbers, I'm either a former Baptist evangelist, the way I count numbers, and you know what we mean by that, or I have to tell you, I count numbers based on toilets.
Yeah, that's the truth. That's where the truth is.
Well, exactly, because I could say how many tickets you sold, how many volunteers you have, how many companies you have, how many vendors you have. But the fact is, all of them's going to have to take a poop. And so I gotta have enough toilets for all of them. So I know how many people I gotta have toilets for. So
Yeah.
we had toilets for about 4,000 people, and nobody seemed to be in distress.
And by the way, I love the site it's at. I mean, one of the great pleasures here is sitting by that slow moving, beautiful, shallow river and bringing my bathing suit and going in there and just sitting on a rock and letting that warm water wash over you. It's just so gorgeous. And all the hammocks between the trees, then the music coming from various venues and the speaking and all the rest. I just love it.
Yeah, it's kind of a magical space. I said when I first walked on site something that was new for me, but I've heard literally thousands of times. I have found my people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is too, that's funny, I've done a lot of speaking, as you know, through the years. I've as little as possible now, by the way. If you want to hear me speak live, come to Wild Goose, because as far as I'm concerned, that's about as much as I want to do for a while. But most places I go, you come in, you go to the airport, you come in. If there are other speakers, you don't hang around. You don't come in early to participate. You just do your thing and get out. The Wild Goose Festival, I find that, first of all, I participate across the board. As you know, I'm there the whole time. I don't come in for my whatever it is. I come the day before and I leave on the day it ends. The other thing that happens with me is that while going to hear my friend Brian McLaren or Diana Butler Bass or all these other people speak, wonderful folks that you have there, and participating on panels, and I help in the children's tent, do other things. It has nothing to do with the numbers. Some of my best meetings have been, with 5 people in a little corner in a rainstorm while we're sheltering under a tarp talking, and then in a bigger venue with a few thousand people listening to me, or, on the main stage at something or whatever. My favorite time is even none of that. It's just walking around, maybe standing, getting a glass of beer or something to eat. And the conversations I get into, I have made friends at Wild Goose that have lasted all these years that I still hear from. I've never been to anything like that. In other words, I can't name the people that I've walked away from other engagements with who weren't either speakers or somebody, quote unquote, on the platform. Not Wild Goose. I have acquaintances and friends across the country who come to Wild Goose that I've stayed in touch with, that I met because we just sat down together and talked, and they said, "Hey, are you Frank Schaeffer? I read something, I have a question." It's not like you're a speaker and they're the public. And I know this sounds like idealistic BS, but it's true. There's not a sort of a class thing where, the speakers are doing their thing and they're huddled somewhere. I think you have like a little green room to give us a little isolation just before we go speak. The rest of the time, we're just out there with everybody else, total access. That's the thing that's different about Wild Goose, is that it's one big family. I love that aspect of it. It's an intentional community. It's not speaker and audience.
Yes. In fact, what I sometimes say to people, it's like everybody brings their best stuff to the thing. Like if we had a dinner on the ground in my little country church, it's like, mom would bring the banana pie and somebody else would bring the songs because they could sing and she could date. And that's what I'll say to folks: just bring your best stuff to the community, whatever your gift is to our people, and do it. And there's a great deal of you use the phrase intentional community. In this fourth quarter of my life, if I could sort of begin to mark a spot, I'd like to mark a spot in which the church, whatever we define that as, becomes essentially horizontal rather than primarily vertical. In fact, I think the thrust of our messaging is how we connect. And even if we look at folks like your Father Rohr and others that go beyond the ideal of just God within us, but God among us, God between us, the Spirit connecting. And so we're pretty intentional about community. We've done things like we even do a thing called Convo Hall, which is about conversations. And the goal is, it's a conversation. You're supposed to set a table with 10 people. Tony Campolo, unfortunately, won't be with us this year. But I remember the first year Tony came, I said, "Would you do this?" Well, Tony's game to do whatever. Well, Tony is so revered. We have a table with 9 other chairs around it. And pretty soon he just had to ask permission. Could he move his group outside under a shade tree? Because he had about 40 people and they were just in a circle. And Tony didn't have an agenda. He wasn't, he wasn't preaching, it's Friday, but Sunday's
Sure.
coming. He was just talking to people. And that's a part of our intentionality of creating that community. And in that regard, I want to say something to you specifically, because I actually used you yesterday as in an example, and I won't call names. But during one of our immediate crises, one of the things we've dealt with over the last few weeks, one of the key persons is someone you drew to my attention one day. Before I was the producer, I was there kind of helping out with technical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you knew I was in some form of leadership, and we knew each other. And you came to me and said, there's this real nice lady that's feeling a little left out. Well, we should go say something to her. I don't know if you even remember this at all, but I vividly do. And so I went and met her, and she held a really important role, but one of those roles that was behind the curtains. And she's not somebody that needs a lot of accolades, but just an occasional thank you so much for what you do. And we established a friendship then. And literally within the last, well, I'll just be a little more specific, within the last 48 hours, I called her in connection to her role, and in less than 10 hours, she is back to me with answers and plans. And that when we talk about community, it's not just that Frank Schaeffer is there as Frank Schaeffer, the speaker, and Frank Schaeffer, the conversationalist. Frank Schaeffer is also the human who feels someone else's needs and encourages them and helps things happen. And that continues to model itself for me as much as I'm able to remember. This person was critical, but nobody was saying thank you. And so I don't want to claim, greatness around it, because I'm sure I miss a lot. But just to realize that, and that happened literally in the last 48 hours for me. So
that's great.
Thanks for your connection.
Going. As you know, I'm going to be talking at the festival a lot about my new book here. Speaking of people forget things, the poster's up behind me: Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. And obviously I'm promoting it now, and I'm asking people to pre-buy it on Amazon, so it drives the numbers and gets bookstores and reviewers interested. But I'm also bringing down some pre-bound copies, because it's published November 2nd, but I'm bringing some uncorrected readers' copies that reviewers get to the festival to, give away and to promote it and all the rest of it. But what I want to say here is, and this is, I'm not making this up for this little segment. As you know, the book has a lot to do with the fact that I am a full-time caregiver to 3 of my 5 grandchildren. And I developed that material. This book, was developed in the talks I first gave at Wild Goose, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years ago, that gradually grew with me. And I started talking about Lucy when she was 3. She just had lunch, by the way, with me here today. I cooked for her. And she's now she's going to be 13 in a week and a half.
My gosh.
So when she was 3, this is like 10 years ago at Wild Goose, I was giving talks out of which this book comes. So when I bring Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy to Wild Goose, totally authentically back to the Wild Goose family, to you, Jeff, and to the others who encouraged me to give these talks and use these personal examples out of my life to build an agenda for a truly family-friendly culture with childcare and education and all the things we need that have been so desperately missing, especially during the COVID epidemic. Changing our priorities from what's good for corporate America and shareholders back to what's actual family values, not the fake right-wing family values we sold in the 70s, which were a form of misogyny, but real family values where people don't have to choose between career and children, because both are provided for well by a social safety net and by community and these other things. This book comes out of Wild Goose. It was born there, and the first bound reader copies that are going to reviewers, I asked for an extra 100 copies for only one purpose, and that was to bring them down to the people at Wild Goose that I've been tracking with on a human level, like you, and to make sure that I hand you one, thank you, sign it, and just say, hey, this came from this festival.
Wow.
So my book and the Wild Goose Festival are one and the same. And I'll go one step further. I think a lot of people who hear about the Wild Goose Festival don't understand that it is a totally family-friendly environment.
Yes.
And one of the most beautiful things, we have rainstorms down there sometimes, and there's huge mud puddles. And, you know, as you well know, up around where the main stage is, there's always these kids sliding through the mud doing the Wild Goose Festival, but very few parents and grandparents allow them to do it home. But because we're out in the woods, the kid, you know, hey, you can literally swing from the trees and slide through the mud. And then you can go wash off in the creek. You see family scenes at Wild Goose. And one of the reasons I always help out in the children's tent is I get to go in there and splash around with paints and tell stories. And it isn't like a few people bring a few kids. It looks to me often that the children, you know, and teens are outnumbering the adults. And I absolutely love it. I mean, camper vans come in and the doors open and these happy families roll out. Yeah. And I think probably kids will look back and say, I was never so free and happy as I was. What was that festival you used to take us to, Mom? Because thinking like a kid for a while, I mean, where else do you get to do this stuff?
Yeah. You know,
in total safety, by the way, because we all look out for the children.
Oh, yeah, we have a really elaborate process for how we monitor all of those things, and you know, and you know, if anybody had concerns, I think they'd be impressed if they were at the meeting. If I'm on the headphones and there's a question, we've got different stages and all kinds of things like that. In my years, we've only locked the grounds once. We did have one time where we couldn't lay our fingers on a child, and we just shut the gate. And when something like that happened, about 75 people immediately went to different places, you know, and
we found everybody.
So I would correct you as a producer, except that you're too accurate. You said it sometimes rains there. Now it pretty much always rains.
Once in a while, we hit a rainstorm.
Yeah, we'll get rains, but yeah, it's just a very free form.
Yeah, but you have not lived until you have a really good musical band playing here, and children in front of the stage, sliding back and forth through mud puddles while their parents dance behind them. And then older people are sitting in chairs behind them. And then I'm somewhere at the beer and hymns tent having my mid-afternoon drink with someone who's offered to buy me a beer, which is a heck of a lot better than just saying, I liked your last book. A very happy space. But the kids, for me, are really the festival's heart. They make
they're magical. And you know, by now,
well, and I'm bringing Amanda back with me this year, by the way, my oldest granddaughter, Amanda. I brought her 1 year. And I told you, I said, I'll come back to the festival. And as usual, I never ask you for an honorarium. You don't pick up my expenses. I just have one deal. I'm bringing my Amanda with me again because she's back in the States and absolutely wants to come back. And so this is the second time around I brought, or is it the third time I brought my granddaughter Amanda with me, and she just absolutely loves it.
We've, you know, and one of the first things I did is I went to our housing person. I said, now Frank wants his regular place, and the place next door needs to be for Amanda. And so, you know, I meet with the housing director once a week, and I go down the list, and there's Frank and Amanda.
Hey, I got the email and I copied Amanda, and she says, I know right where it is. I can't wait. So, you know, we were already talking about going up the road to have breakfast at our usual joint. And, you know, it's like, it's crazy. We just sort of pick up where we left off. I'm so glad that we haven't changed venue because, you know, I know right where everything is. And you go to the place on the hill and have a cup of coffee in the morning. And then there's and by the way, it's right off the Appalachian Trail. So that you can go for these incredible long walks through on this beautiful section of the trail right there. It goes right through Hot Springs.
The sidewalk in downtown Hot Springs has embossed in it AT for the Appalachian Trail. And the reason for that is the trail crosses the French Broad River there at our intersection because it has to come there to cross that river. So there's, you know, great walking spaces. It's
really unbelievable.
It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's a wonderful place, and things happen there that don't happen a lot of places. I won't read the whole thing. I won't read it at all, but I'll tell you. A friend of mine, you know, Stan Mitchell.
Absolutely.
Stan posted something this last week about the 2018 festival, and the story goes about like this. It was on Sunday. We were having communion. He was in line behind a person that was a trans person, and the person seemed to be struggling. And his first instinct was to give assistance, but then he held back and waited, and they move up front, and the person with a great deal of trepidation reaches out and receives the elements, has the bread soaked in wine, and almost momentously takes it and begins to cry and moves off to the side. And Stan, being the sensitive pastoral person he is, followed her over but gave her distance. And in a few minutes, he gave her a Kleenex, and they began to talk. And the story goes like this. This was a person who 50-something years ago, 50-something years ago, was a cradle person, a cradle Catholic in New England, and went to her priest and confessed, and this is in writing, so I'm not betraying something, but confessed that she was about to begin, or he was about to begin, the process of transition as a transgender person. The priest didn't say anything, had prayer, and they left. And then the next Sunday, the priest withheld the elements from her when she went down front, and she's not been back to the church since then. Right. As she got older and past the age of 70, she got diagnosed with some pretty dramatic anticipation of some early dementia issues. And so she created kind of a bucket list. And one of them was to make peace with the church. And someone there in New England actually said to that person, I know the place where that might happen, and took her to Wild Goose. And so on that Sunday, this person who had not interacted that way for all those decades took communion for the first time in 50 years, and they were sitting there and rejoicing. And then Stan said to her, says, do you know that the person that gave you the elements is a transgender person? And she said, no, I didn't know that. And of course, it accelerated the thing. Well, the beauty of that morning, because there's in Stan's story, he mentions me in it. And when I told him about this, the person that was giving the elements at that spot is a dear friend of mine. And she's posted back. So again, it's not a personal betrayal. Her name is Renee. I went to Renee and said, would you be one of our participants in communion? She's a very quiet person. She looked at me kind of almost stunned. No, I don't think so. And I started to walk away, and she said, are you sure you really want me to do that? I said, yeah, that's why I came to you, and we really want you to do that. And she began to cry, and she said, I'll do it. She then told me that before she made her transition, she had been a significant leader in the church, and that her favorite thing to do was to provide the elements in communion. But since she had begun her transition 10 years earlier, she'd never been asked to do that. And she couldn't even imagine that even at Wild Goose, we wanted her to do that. And it was just such an amazing celebration. And while I love the fact that, some years you'll see Amy Grant on the stage singing, and you'll hear Frank Schaeffer and Brian McLaren and Reverend Barber doing their things, those things that are the things that we hear. In fact, sometimes I feel selfish in my role to hear those kinds of stories and just hope that everybody else knows this is what's going on at Wild Goose. We try to make it fun, we try to make it exciting, and we try to make it challenging, and we try to stretch you a little bit. But you just the folks just need to know that all over the place, those kinds of things are literally happening day by day.
Yeah. And I was speaking earlier of my favorite part of the festival being, what you might call the informal conversations are actually the reason for the festival. The music and my talking and other people talking that's peripheral to these exchanges and to the sharing experience in a community where there are people who you are meeting from across the board. And I must say, it's one of the few places that has any kind of religious connotation where I don't know anyone of any color, of any gender, of any background that would feel unsafe there.
Yeah.
And I don't mean safe just physically, but unsafe. It's one of the only places I find I can completely be myself.
Yeah.
Because when I talk about people that I came out of this Reformed Calvinist background, I look back with horror at the way I was so strict with my children and tried to push my wife around when we were first married, because I'd been trained to be a patriarchal, jerk by divine right, you could put it this way, in charge of everybody around me. That journey away from there, Wild Goose is one of the places that I was able to start talking about that, out of which a lot of writing, like my new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, came. And I tell that story there. I would not have been able to tell that story honestly in this book unless I had been able to practice telling the truth to people that I wasn't feeling judged by at Wild Goose. So when you sit down with a trans person, when you sit down with a non-binary person, and suddenly they become friends, not sort of token friend, like, oh, some of my friends are fill in the blank when you're trying to be a little cooler than you really are. But actually, like, no, I've known her for years now. And I met there. I don't think there's a place in the country that I know of that brings people together in a spiritual fold like Wild Goose. I've never heard of one. You hear of other big festivals like Red Man and Burning Festival and all this stuff, but you don't hear of that level of spiritual and psychological comfort outside of Wild Goose, that at least in my experience. So, maybe there's a bar somewhere, a restaurant, or friends you gather with where you feel that level of comfort, but to go into a group of strangers and have a kind of an unwritten guarantee of how you will be received, no matter however damaged or wounded you are, like me, coming from a background with many regrets, having been a religious right leader, basically specializing in honing the sharp point of the right-wing spear of misogyny, which is what I spent my youth doing as a sidekick in the anti-abortion movement, to be able to come back and not only be forgiven, but to become part of something of trying to build an alternative to that, has very much restored me. And I know that people coming from other backgrounds have found that same level of restoration. So it isn't only the trans person who finds a level of acceptance. It can be somebody who has regrets having been on the wrong side of these issues.
Yes.
And comes back in a framework of repentance.
Yes.
And then sits down with the very people he or she spent years damaging.
Yes.
And admit who you were and seek real forgiveness on a one-on-one basis. And that's something that I have experienced at Wild Goose personally.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I remember when I wanted to come into this broader community of which Wild Goose is a large part. I was having a very fortuitous lunch meeting with Phyllis Tickle.
Yes.
And I didn't know Phyllis.
I remember her so well.
Yeah, I love Phyllis, and a mutual friend said, you should meet Phyllis Tickle. And I said, well, I'd like that, but she's Phyllis Tickle and I'm not. And she invited myself and Rick Meredith, our creative director. We went out to her house and we had a 1-hour meeting that lasted almost 7. And one of our questions was, old evangelicals. Rick, for example, was the first creative director at Willow Creek. It's like we kind of want to participate some places, or a spot for us, because we kind of had a little bit of that too. It's like, well, we had blood on our hands of sorts. And she said, absolutely. And she said, you've got to, and she picks up the phone and calls Brian McLaren and says, I'm sitting here at my breakfast table with the fellow you've got to know. And next thing you know, you knew Phyllis. So it's like all of a sudden there's all kinds of people playing. It's like the actors, in the wings at a theater, trying to everybody get in position before they raise the curtain. So yeah, I came with a little bit of that sense of, would they accept me? There's just not a lot of sense of rejection overall. It's almost like maybe the only thing we want to reject is rejecting.
And what's interesting for me personally is to see some of the fruit that's come out of that. I was talking about the fact that my new book very much came out of my experience at Wild Goose, and the talks I gave there are what this became this book. And it was the beginning of it. But another thing that came out of it was the Vote Common Good group that I've been part of. Yes. I met Samir there. I met Doug Padgett at Wild Goose. Vote Common Good came out of Wild Goose indirectly. Yes. And then we're all in a bus touring the country in the 2018 elections, trying to flip the House toward the Democratic Party. talking to evangelicals and former evangelicals, who, by the way, all should be at Wild Goose, if you heard of something, who were considering maybe not voting for Republicans and for Trump another time around because they felt a little bit betrayed, trying to peel away that 2 or 3% of people who were where I was a few years before that, having grown past that to a more inclusive version of faith. So the interesting thing is, out of Wild Goose comes Brian McLaren counseling with Democratic candidates, teaching them how to speak effectively to people of faith, or Doug Padgett building an entire outreach that puts 20 some of us in buses on the road around the country, speaking in all 50 states, not to religious groups, but to voters, while we have candidates like Ted Lieu, who, by the way, I interviewed a few weeks ago on this program, Representative Ted Lieu of California, who I think is second or third in command in Congress now. And Ted, by the way, said, when he talked about Vote Common Good, that you guys helped flip the House. So we got a little credit there from Ted. That all starts at Wild Goose with Doug Padgett, Brian McLaren, myself, Samir, and a number of other people. Okay, that's where we all met. So I first met the people who then became Vote Common Good when we shared a rental car ride from one of the airports in a rainstorm to one of the first venue where Wild Goose was the first year, which was not Hot Springs. But so I've actually seen stuff come out of Wild Goose that could not have happened except for the atmosphere it provides. And I know I'm not alone, because I've met authors who have started books there. I've met other people who became known because of Wild Goose. I met people like Reverend Barber, who will be back there again, who his assistant, the person who helps run everything for him, was someone I first met at Wild Goose. I've met people who started publishing companies coming out of Wild Goose. You must have tons of stories of people who went off and did things after that, but it's not a coincidence. I mean, it's a very fruitful 4 days.
Well, one of our aspirations is to essentially enlarge the footprint of the kind of faith we're communicating, and anytime we can be participative in doing that in any sort of supportive way. I remember saying to Doug Padgett earlier in our process, because I'm a systems person, we were having a general conversation, and I said, as we pray that that we will have heaven on earth, or that, in the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, let me just go ahead and tell you, as a systems person, I do not think databases in heaven have passwords. And it's like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, if we can support whatever you're doing, we'll support it. It's not like we got a secret room and you got to have a magic wand or something to get in it. Doug will be back this year. Going to be there with us one day talking about, we're going to do some work around Christian nationalism with Doug. And then he's also going to talk about this initiative he'll have in the fall of riding bicycles all the way across the border of the U.S. And people that don't know Doug, he was a marathoner, and now I think his knees are problematic, so now he's a bicycler. I'm intimidated by that because Doug and I are friends, and I'm a bicycler, and I think I'm a long distance bicycler. Whenever you're with Doug, you're not a long distance bicycler. You're a guy that rides a
correction.
bicycle.
You're not a long distance anything.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I have a lot of energy, but Doug Padgett, if you ever watch this, I want to just tell you that, we all follow you blindly because you're a leader when you're on the road with us, packed into buses and taking us places, but you also just run us all straight into the ground. I mean, everybody has to go home and rest. And the only person who's along for the whole ride is Doug.
Yeah.
And it's like we all go rest from Doug, come back to Doug, and then Doug leads us further.
Yeah, you're on his bicycle ride. As a bicycle rider, I'm going to go and ride some. And I'm thinking, okay, what segments can I ride? And I said, but Jesus, Doug's going to ride the whole freaking thing. Yeah.
Well, when we're out on the road, when Doug does these things like Vote Common Good, it's the only time I'm grateful for the fact that I had polio when I'm 2, and I have a withered, atrophied left leg, because if worse comes to worse, yes, I hike and I ski and everything, but I can always say, hey, I have a problem here. I'm not going to ride across the country in a bicycle. I'll follow in the safety car.
Doug's energy and imagination.
Well, and second only to Brian McLaren, who also is a wild goose aficionado,
Oh, yeah.
founder, everything. You know, I go places and I show up and Brian's just done 30 things in a row and
Yeah.
I'm already tired.
Yeah, I texted Brian the other day because I will get varieties of people that have said to me, Brian says, I talked to Brian and he and I are going to do, and they'll tell me what it is. And so I said, now, Brian, I've got you down for the following, but I've got this other list. Can you tell me what you're expecting to do here? And sure enough, by the time it's over, Brian will have done an unlimited amount of
Brian
stuff.
McLaren is a force to be reckoned with and also a very good friend of both of us. Now tell me, what is Brian doing this year in the festival? Because I just was with him in New York at a rooftop event where I gave a little talk about my new book. And Brian was giving some material there that I hope he's sharing at the festival. What is he talking about?
I think
I've interviewed him on this program, by the way, on his new book, Faith After Doubt, which is a really good book. I have it right here, by the way.
Yeah, I've got a copy of it.
This is Faith After Doubt. And this is Brian McLaren's new book. And I hope he talks about that. But Brian also has been developing some wonderful new material on how we perceive reality and so forth and so on. I wonder if, is he giving you any?
I'm not really sure.
What's he talking about?
We haven't talked in detail, but I hosted, Wild Goose hosted he and Diana Butler Bass a week or two ago.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was around, Diana's newest book and Brian's newest book. Both are a little more expressly memoir oriented. Now, they don't say this is my spiritual.
Jesus. This is Diana's book. And Diana was on this too. So by the way, for folks who look at this podcast of In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, you can go back and find my Brian McLaren and Diana interviews, both of which were sensational. They're both fantastic people. I love talking to them on the program, but I'm just interested, what are they doing here at Wild Goose? Without
going into too much detail, the only thing I know a lot of detail about, and I won't basically give his thunder away on that, Brian is our opening preacher. And he's teaming up with Jennifer Knapp. Do you know Jennifer Knapp? Jennifer was
go ahead and tell us about her.
Jennifer was a frequently Grammy nominated artist. And a few years ago, she came out as a lesbian. And of course, that changed the arc of her history in that world.
Yeah.
She's our artist in residence this year. And what Brian wanted to do as the opening preacher was work the opening segment around with he and Jennifer. And I guess the one thing I can say, and if Brian is upset at this, we'll just ignore him. Yeah. I think he's going to sing this year.
He is with her. You had me up there with Ken Miedema one time.
Yeah.
And Ken was playing the keyboard and then I would do my little thing and he'd play. And I thought, this is going to be hell on earth. I hate this. I'll never do it. And then actually it was great. So, you do weird pairings, but I was up there with the blind musician and he's up there with the musician and, make him sing. That's good.
Yeah. Well, the last I heard, he'd said that one of the tunes they're going to do, he's going to sing. There'll be the opening night sermon. By the way, you speak of Ken Miedema, James Forbes, Reverend Jim Forbes, Pastor Emeritus of Riverside Church, will be back with us this year.
Oh, wow.
And it's kind of funny, of course. He's a great homiletician and he's who he is, and so a person that knew who I was, but I didn't know, sends me an email and says, I know it's late and your deadline has passed, but I have a friend who said that he would like to come if he were invited. Is there room for Reverend Dr. James Forbes?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, we'll make room for Dr. Forbes.
Yeah, we'll knock Frank Schaeffer out of the program.
I said, Schaeffer's coming to move him out of the way. So
Frank will do whatever he's asked. Tell him to go to the children's tent. To hell with his appearance.
Yeah. So I've gotten to chat with Dr. Forbes several times since then. And I was talking to him and for those of you that don't know Ken Miedema, Ken is a guy that was big in the CCM world, as they called it, especially in the 70s and 80s. He would have been contemporaries with Phil Keaggy and Chuck Girard and all those early CCM artists. And he's a blind piano player. And he does this thing where he'll let you speak and he'll just sit on the stage and he's not taking notes, but
Yeah.
And then, but when you're done, he will sing back what you just said, and it's not
Yeah,
hokey.
riffs on it in the music.
Yeah, he
And it
riffs.
actually works. It sounds really crazy or like something out of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but
Yes.
actually it really works well. And because he's an old guy, I'm getting up there now too. But I mean, old guys can do more because everybody says, well, you know, he's an old guy. We don't expect much. And then all of a sudden, you know,
It blows your mind.
it blows your mind.
Yeah, so I was chatting with Forbes, and I was trying to explain how we would do it. I said, well, you'll be in a spot where we'll have, I said, do you know this guy, Ken Meadema? Ken Meadema, if you told me Ken Meadema was coming, we wouldn't even talk about this. And he went on to say that Ken's wife was in one of his classes once upon a time.
Yeah.
And Ken was sitting in the back, and he talked. And then at some point in time, Ken asked if he might respond. It just as he didn't even know who he was. Said, this guy comes up front, gets on the piano, and sings a song that said everything I'd said all day long in the service. So of course I'm coming with Ken. Yeah, so Ken would be doing his thing. Brian has a couple of other segments. I hope that some people will talk with Brian. The conversation the other day around we can go theologically to the 80s and 90s and talk about Yale and narrative theology, and some of us have read those books. But the ideal of theology as narrative is incredible. And so we got a chunk of that with Diana and Brian the other day. In fact, I was reading some James Cone last night, and he has a beautiful line around the nature of theology as narrative, because it sort of individualizes, for example.
Yeah.
Because once again, we were in the mass market message, and we sort of got validated by whether or not we did all the right rules. And the biggest difference was whether or not your plan of salvation was all Romans road, or did you veer over and throw some revelation in it? I mean, that was how much diversity we would have, at least in my growing up days. But the ideal that ultimately my theology is my theology, it's my story, it's my narrative. It validates me, and it validates, in my impression, the God in me and the Emmanuel among us. And so they did some really good work around that the other day. It also kicked me back to something you said, because maybe I said this to Brian afterwards. I've never written a book. I've written a lot of other stuff, but I've wanted to write a book. And I'm still locked in sort of that old world of like, if you write a book, you got to wait until you got everything fixed.
Right.
And I was talking with you about that a year or two ago, and you basically disabused that notion, that you're kind of writing your narrative, even if you don't say this is my narrative, even if you don't say this is, and that has just opened me up in so many ways to, I don't know, maybe I'm overstating it, but for me to believe that my narrative now is my narrative right now. And
it's interesting you say that, because the fact is, I was telling you how the new book I've got coming out came out of my talks a while. Goose, when I say talks, I just have to explain this to people. I don't mean the formal talks from the platform. I'm talking about all the conversations. It's like a comedian testing material in front of a small venue before you get your Netflix special. You have to hope and pray you get a chance to just run it by some people. Well, similarly, when I was making movies in the 80s in Hollywood, having dropped out of the evangelical community, I made 4 really crappy, well, they weren't really crappy compared to what you see today. They were pretty good compared to the crap now, but they were very mediocre films. My wife, Jeannie, said, why don't you write a script telling the same stories about your childhood growing up that you tell our children at the table? And so I started my first novel, Portofino, as a screenplay, and it took off and was very successful and became a trilogy, the Calvin Becker trilogy, Portofino, Saving Grandma, Zermatt. By the way, Brian McLaren is my best salesperson on that, because he loves those novels and talks about them all the time. So thank you, Brian. But the fact is, they came out of personal storytelling to my children. And what interested them turned out to interest a lot of people around the world in many different languages, and became a trilogy. Well, similarly, when I saw people's eyes light up when I started telling them stories about my grandchildren at Wild Goose, it was like, oh, well, the way I'm telling these stories is interesting people. I will use this material. And now in the new book, fall in love, have children, stay put, and so forth. All of a sudden that all comes together, but it didn't begin by writing a book. It began with just my stories. And then, of course, the second thing is, nobody's ever ready for anything, whether it's a relationship or having a child, let alone writing a book. The way you do it is you just start and you stumble along. And most of my book projects have taken a couple of years. This one took 5 because I started sending it to my sciencey educated friends who told me, you're on the right track, but you don't know what you're talking about. Here's 5 more books you need to read before you even begin to talk about evolutionary biology. And then I would stop and read and study. And eventually I got this together in terms of what real family and love is and the dynamic and where it comes from and why gay adoptive parents have the same biological, neurological, hormonal response to children as biological parents. I had an inkling of this, but it was intuitive. And now that I've done 5 years of study and work, it's ready to be published. But it came out of telling stories at Wild Goose. And I think people have got to understand that evolution.
Well,
not just for me, but for everybody.
Sure. That's a beautiful explanation. And I want to affirm in a very positive way, the professor in me is very impressed with your research in this book.
Thank you.
You've done a great job of supporting what I'm sure came to you essentially intuitively. And a lot of it is, while it was intuitive to you, it's sort of culturally counterintuitive. And so finding, if you will, the science, for it, made some sense to me. I've read the book. I like the book. I've got some things in there I hope you'll drill down on, but I don't know. I think we do this for an hour. Is that right? So we're about to wrap up.
Yeah, we will in a minute, but we can do more at Wild Goose too.
Well, let me just say on Wild Goose, Reverend Barbara will be there. For example, on Saturday morning, it will open up with a person named Raquel Gill preaching. I wanted a person that can preach that we don't know. And our mutual friend, Otis Moss III, said, contact Raquel Gill. So in my world, if Otis Moss says Raquel can preach, I don't have to have another reference. So she'll open up. The next person up will be Jim Wallace. The next person up will be Jim Forbes. The next person up will be William Barber. That's on main stage Saturday morning.
Right.
Frank will be speaking from what we call the living room stage. And we like that because it's a much more engaged and interactive kind of a stage than the main stage. We got a lot of good musicians. One of our favorites is Phil Madeira, who leads Emmylou Harris's band, the Red Dirt Boys. Phil Madeira and the Red Dirt Boys will be there. So lots of folks. It's going to be good. I just want to say a couple of things, if I can, about the book. There's a whole bunch of things I'd like to talk about, but I love one of your lines. Our desk, you quoted Derek Thompson, our desks were never meant to be our altars. And looking back on my life, wow, I can't tell you how many times, I prayed at my desk, so to speak. And by that, I mean, I was praying, not even, you know where I'm going with that. Yeah. But I think you've done like I told you earlier, how excited I was to meet Jeannie. I really would like to meet Lucy. I've just got to tell you. So you said you had lunch with her today. It's like, well, she'd held her around long enough for me to say hello, because I kind of feel like I know her. I think you do a great job of putting those pieces together and personalizing it. And I could go in lots of ways, but I want to say you actually, let me see, using ourselves up through the capitalism of disruption. Before I finished that chapter, I was on Amazon buying 3 books. You quoted a Dugan book, A Mean Girl, Ayn Rand and the Culture of Greed. And when I looked that up, I had to get another one of Dugan's books. And then you quoted Brotopia, and I had to get that one. I don't know whether you've got a focus energy. I don't know where you're thinking about that. But for me, both as an academic, as well as a practitioner and a politician, I used to be the managing partner of a political consulting firm that was pretty successful. Our most famous client was Barack Obama's Senate race. So we had some pretty good success there. but the pervasive, invasive nature of what we loosely call, neoliberalism, libertarianism, Ayn Randism, into every factor of our life, our churches. How can our churches embrace a particular ideology? And it's literally embracing Ayn Rand's theses. And you've got some really interesting things, to say in there. And you point out that, let me see, there's another line from that. I like that you connected over to Nietzsche there. But women have paid the highest price for our libertarian, career-centric, corporate welfare coddled so-called free market. That's a Frank Schaeffer line. Women have paid the highest price. In fact of the matter is, I don't know if I should mention the book because it would place me a little bit farther left than some people even imagine I am. But have you ever read anything by Sylvia Federici?
Mm-hmm.
She points out that if we understand economics, and there's four classic factors of production in economics, and one of them is labor. If you don't have labor, you're not going to have an economic engine, just period. If we go over there and turn off the button that includes space for labor to come into the economic cycle, it just stops. We need financial capitalism, we need entrepreneurship, we need land, buildings, and so forth. That's the four factors. Where do we get our labor? Well, most of Western civilization, most of the US has been built on free labor from indentured servants, slaves, and women taken over as producers of free labor. If you think of it, we send a woman home to generate the labor market and almost demean the fact that she's doing it. And with if you will, no compensation. I like that you came close. You moved all around that sort of stuff, around the sort of the roles of people in life. But those pieces, I've got notes all over them. I've got 2 pages of notes in my notebook. I've got pages of notes on your book, because that's one of the things you do really well, is create that theater of my mind and just get me running deep. And I don't know whether you have the energy for it, but some one of us needs to really peel back Ayn Rand's role in contemporary politics and Ayn Rand's role in contemporary religious expression.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I write about her quite a bit in the book, but obviously it's just on the way through to making bigger points about the fact that unless we redefine success as success in human relationships first, we're going to continue to be a misogynistic culture.
Exactly.
That sees quote unquote traditional women's roles as somehow lesser. And of course, what I talk about in the book is that as a father and grandfather, I've found that actually those are the roles in my own life, having just cooked lunch for 3 of my grandchildren today again, that have given me meaning and purpose. And the whole question is, for instance, just to give one example, look at our Social Security system. Someone takes care of a child and is at home, and that work is not, quote, compensated labor. They don't draw any Social Security. In other words, that is not recognized as having benefited our society. Whereas the person who went to work in the so-called labor market is compensated. Well, there's thousands of examples like that. And of course, Ayn Rand is insidious because what she did was glorify male hegemony over the culture and this idea of the superhero. And obviously, it's the opposite of everything people of faith say they believe. So the irony is that white evangelical Christianity has supported a system which is literally, not in the biblical sense, but literally anti-Christ.
Yes.
You could not come up with a system that is less to a Christian ethic than the American capitalist system. So, my book deconstructs this, but it also essentially gets into the fact that relationships are important, and that unless we put a priority on people's roles that actually make life possible, which is caregiving, and I don't mean women, I mean men caregivers, all of us. In that sense, we are all either parents caring for the people around us from cradle to grave, or we are not. And so that's the challenge of the book.
Do you remember?
It has nothing to do with straight, monogamous, white, upper class relationships. This applies to non-binary people with relationships, pair bonded people, that's not the point. the point is what we consider our priorities.
Do you remember your in the book you made reference to enjoying this just like the other young mothers? Do you remember that?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I said, well, a friend of mine said, what are you doing? And I told him I was picking the kids up at school, my grandchildren. I said, I love being one of the young mothers. And he stopped and said, well, what do you mean? And of course, I wasn't referring to gender, but that this great leveling of caring about other people, levels the playing field. So when you're basically doing a school pickup, whether you're a grandparent or black, white, transgender, doesn't matter. At that point, the vulnerability you have in the love you have that's unconditional for that child puts you on a level playing field for a moment. It's one of the only areas where that happens.
Yeah, I like that. In 1979, I became a drama mama in the suburbs of Chicago. They had a whole thing, and I've done, and so it's like I volunteered, and it was very problematic because they never actually had a non-female be a drama mama, but it just reminded me of that. I want to say on the book, I think that a person can read the book in two ways. I'm sure you can read it more than that, but you can read Frank's book, you can read this book, and let me just take a step further back. Part of what I think you're saying to us here now is we're in the process, whatever that means, of coming through COVID. We're experiencing a paradigm shift. And there's all of this shuffling going on about like, how do we return to normal? And there's kind of a question of like, well, do we really want to return to normal? What did we learn from this? And you keep reminding us that most of us learn from this things like community, things like connectedness, things like the meaning of actually spending more time with our children, or and those things. And so I see this as sort of a call to say, let's don't return to the old normal, the normal that was fed by all of these things. Let's return to a better future. And I think you can read the book and receive encouragement for that and guidance for that. And then for me, I guess the academic side of me is I would read the book also, and I would bump into sections and say, we got to drill down on this. We got to go further on this. We need to, and Ayn Rand just happened to be, one for me, and there's about 3 or 4 different categories there. And, I think to make the kind of changes that we're dreaming for, we need a lot of people who just want it to be true.
Yes.
And then some of us maybe who are influencing other market spaces can make particular challenges.
Yeah.
Like, there's a certain assumption of the so-called laws of economics. And I'm a professor in a business school. And somebody will say, well, do you teach the laws of economics? I said, well, I teach some of the assumptions you make about economics, but they're not laws. And I teach you that these are some assumptions people make, but they could have made different assumptions, and that maybe we should. Well, that messes up the whole model of an economic system. So you've done the job of consoling me, encouraging me, pointing me forward, and at the same time, stimulating me to want to go deeper on some stuff.
Well, we will come back and do another session and drill down on some of those topics, and maybe we can do something where you pick the topics, we drill down a little more, what's in my book, what's not in my book. That said, we need to move on, and I will just say this in conclusion, and that is that the new book of mine that I have sitting here, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, I will be launching it at Wild Goose, which is appropriate because the train of thought began at Wild Goose about 8 or 9 years ago, and so it will be a coming home. I also hope that the Wild Goose family will help me make this not a book, but a movement that moves away from corporate philosophy and making money and acquiring stuff to focus on what I call real family values, which is putting the people in our lives first. Irrespective of whether we have children or not, that's not the point. So if you will help me make it into a movement, then the real circle will be complete, because Wild Goose itself is a movement. Thank you. We have links to Wild Goose and the book on our show page, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I've been talking with Jeff Clark, who is many things. Please share this, like it, and let your friends know it will soon be a podcast. And Jeff, thank you so much. And I hope you can share this with our Wild Goose family as a kind of a little introduction to what we're going to be doing down there in a little while.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Much love.